Good evening. Sound is good. Everybody can hear the back. Okay. My name is Werner Steger, and I'm a professor of history here at DCC. And it is my honor to welcome you to the 6th installment of the Dr. D. David Conklin Distinguished Lecture Series, and continue what has hopefully now has become a tradition of bringing the country's top scholars to campus and continue to make significant intellectual contributions to the cultural life of our community. At this point, please turn off your cell phones, or about turn them off, right? A note regarding the logistics. The lecture will be followed as usual by a brief Q&A session, and a book signing, a sale and signing will be available outside right after the lecture, outside in the hallway. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to recognize some distinguished guests who are here with us tonight. Please hold your applause until the end of the honors roll call. Dr. Peter Jordan, President of Dutchess Community College, Dr. D. David Conklin, former President of DCC, who established the endowment of this lecture series. It's my pleasure to welcome Stephen Caswell, member of the DCC Board of Trustees and County Legislator. And I'm particularly pleased that so many members of the Dutchess Community College Foundation's board are in attendance tonight. Paul Conrad, Michael Hall, David Kelly, Shirley Robertson Brereton, Susan Skivel at McCormick, Kelly Traver, and David Wise. In addition, I would like to recognize and thank Diana Pollard, Executive Director of the DCC Foundation, and her staff, who have ably organized the logistics of this event. Thank you all for the work you do to make events like this, like tonight's, possible. Thank you. Now, my pleasure, and I'm tickled by it, my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker to you. Dr. Heather Ann Thompson is the Frank W. Thompson Collegiate Professor of History and Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. She is the author and editor of several books and articles and book chapters that are really too numerous to list here. Her first book, Who's Detroit? Politics, Labor, and Race in a Modern American City, published in 2001 and republished in 2017, was a groundbreaking study of Black politics in urban America. She's best known for her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Blood in the Water, the Attica Prison Uprising of 1971 and its Legacy, published in 2016. So, brief context, until roughly 15 years ago, the phenomenon of mass incarceration and the carceral state in the United States were issues that have gone largely unaddressed by American historians. This was a remarkable scholarly lacuna, considering that by the mid-2010s, between 65 and 70 million Americans had a criminal record of some sort, a number unmatched in the rest of the world. Dr. Thompson was one of the first, if not the first, historian who addressed this gap in her seminal essay, Why Mass Incarceration Matters, Rethinking Crisis, Decline, and Transformation in the Post-War United States, which was published by the Journal of American History in December 2010. I consider the essay, which received the Best Article Prize from the Urban History Association, sort of the founding document of the history of mass incarceration. This was followed in 2015 by a special issue of the Journal of American History dedicated to historians and the carceral state, which was co-edited by Dr. Thompson. Her work on this subject culminated in the publication in 2016 of Blood in the Water, which brought the issue of mass incarceration also to a popular lay audience. Apart from the Pulitzer, the book also received the Bancroft Prize for the best book published in American history, 5 additional book awards, and it was a finalist for the National Book Award. The book was reviewed by over 100 journals, magazines, and newspapers, and landed on 14 Best of 2016 book lists, including the New York Times Most Notable Books of 2016. And Blood in the Water will soon come to a theater near you. The book has been optioned by TriStar Pictures and will be adapted for film. All this should really want you to buy and read the book. You can do so right after the lecture, and Dr. Thompson will be happy to sign it for you. I can promise you a reading experience after you read the introduction that is called State Secrets. It will be hard to put it down, and you'll find some fairly tragic stories and also, I think, probably infuriating stories in there. As a public historian in the best sense of the word, Dr. Thompson has also made her expertise available in copious articles, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and The Atlantic, among many, many others. As a scholar activist for criminal justice reform, Dr. Thompson has served in the National Academy of Sciences Blue Ribbon panel that studied the causes and consequences of mass incarceration, as well as on the boards of several policy organizations, such as the Prison Policy Initiative and the Alliance of Families for Justice, and she is the co-director of the Carceral State Project at the University of Michigan. She is currently working on a book about Bernie Goetz's vigilante subway shootings in 1984 and the 1985 police bombing of Move in Philadelphia. This evening she will talk about the Attica prison uprising of 1971 and why it matters today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Thompson to DCC.
Well, it's beautiful lighting in here, but I will need my glasses. Wow, well, thank you. What a generous introduction. Thank you to President Jordan for having me here, for David Conklin and his wife Jackie for having me here, the board, the DCC community, the foundation staff. Everybody has been so warm and welcoming since I've arrived, and thank you also to Werner Steger. What a delightful introduction, way too generous. I am thrilled to be here. I have to say that I'm always both very excited but also somewhat nervous to give this talk in New York. As you might imagine, this is a ground zero topic for New York, and I have had the opportunity to talk about Attica all over the country, but of course in New York it has special resonance in no small part because in so many ways people are connected to this story, maybe in ways that they don't even realize that they're still connected to this story. And so what I would love to do tonight is set the stage for the story, tell you a little bit about why I think it's something that we should be even talking about today, even though it's now, 53 years in the past. And then hopefully take your questions about the process of writing the book or whatever else you want to talk about. Let me start with this and make sure that I have my technology correct. There we go. I want to just start off by making this bold assertion that I think that if we learn more about the story that happened way back in 1971, it really does help us to make better sense of where we are today. And when I say where we are today, what I mean is this. This is, by the way, after about 20 years of attempts to reform our criminal justice system, and this is what we call the whole pie of mass incarceration. If you just look at the numbers, it is a staggering number of people in this country who live their lives behind bars. This is a huge prison population, but it is importantly an out of sync with the rest of the world prison population, as you see from this graph. We lock up more people than any other country on the globe. This is also a phenomenon that affects so many people well beyond the experience of being in prison. I don't know if you can see some of these numbers, but this lists who is incarcerated today, who's been formerly incarcerated, who has a felony charge, who has a record in general, and how many people are adjacent, connected to people who have a record. And so this is not even talking about children of the incarcerated, parents of the incarcerated, and the ripple effects in community of incarceration. This is a phenomenon that if you pay very close attention to it, it is very closely tied to our political system. By the way, our political system across the aisle. Democrats, Republicans, it doesn't matter. Everybody's hands are in this pie over time. And there's been some really significant rulings, acts, laws, pieces of legislation that have moved this needle upward. What is staggering about these numbers, though, is that they're not just numbers. These are highly racially disparate numbers, which is something else that we have to take very seriously. If you look at the ratio just between black and white incarceration in this country at the top, you notice something really incredible, which is that our racial disproportionality is worse than South Africa's was at the height of apartheid. If you look at the state of New York, to be more specific, you see that this disproportionality is, again, glaring, staggering. If you look at the percentage of who is incarcerated versus who is actually representative in the population, it is also staggering. One of the reasons for this is the disproportionality of the adjudication of laws. And we just know this. I always pick the easiest example of this, which is the policing of marijuana. We know that white people like their marijuana as much as anybody else. And yet, if you were to look at the counties of marijuana arrests, you see, again, how staggeringly disproportionate this is. So the old adage, if you do the crime, you're going to assuredly do the time, is actually much more complicated than that. It has to do with where laws are enforced versus not oftentimes. What is really incredible about this kind of overview that I just gave you is that we have a lot of misconceptions about it. We have a view sometimes that, well, this is very regrettable and it is kind of ugly, but we had to do it. Crime was out of control. We had to do this. Well, actually, one of the great things about being a historian is you get to go back and you actually get to look at stuff and say, well, is that actually true? Is that really what happened? And we find out some really interesting things. We actually begin the war on crime with Lyndon Johnson's administration, not Nixon's administration, which is sort of interesting, with the creation of the Law Enforcement Administration Act in 1965. And what you really notice that's kind of just fascinating about this is that just take murder. I figure that we can agree that that is a crime, even though lots of crimes change what they are. But, you know, homicide seems to be one of the enduring crimes. And if you look at this, you notice that, really interestingly, the crime rate had not been so low in 1965 than 1911. Interestingly, you also notice that when we criminalize certain things like alcohol, the crime rate goes up pretty dramatically. And if you look at the violent crime rate, you notice that at the height of criminalization, which we've been backing off from somewhat, the violent crime rate also increases. So one might argue that this is a political decision. It's a policy decision. And in fact, that was the conclusion that the national board that I served on came to and reported as much to Congress, which is in part what touched off so much of the rethinking of mandatory minimums and pretty heavy-duty sentencing. So what does Attica have to do with this? Well, it isn't just that we start to mass incarcerate after, the 60s, kind of generally. In fact, we don't start mass incarcerating when we start the war on crime. If you look at when the graph of prison rates go through the roof, it's actually not in 1965, 1966, 1967, it's actually in about 1972. And I'm going to make a case for you that there are in fact many reasons why this happens, but in ways that I think we fail to appreciate, Attica had a lot to do with this turn of events. Or at least I'm going to try to persuade you of this. This is the book that I wrote called Blood in the Water. And again, it's a big book. If you see, it's a heavy book. You can use it as a book stop if you don't feel, or as a door stop if you don't feel like reading it. But one of the reasons it's so lengthy is that it took an incredible amount of time to write, 13 years actually, to write this book, because it was a journey to write this book. The state of New York had pretty much sealed the records. You could not get access to what had really happened. So part of the journey of writing this book was to try to figure out what actually happened here, because the prisoners were telling one story, various administrations were telling another story, townspeople were telling another story. So I approached this book to say, I'm going to talk to troopers, I'm going to talk to guards, I'm going to talk to formerly incarcerated people, I'm going to talk to judges, lawyers, and basically, if the state of New York says I can't see the records, I'm going to figure out who has the copy, who has the original, who has something buried in their backyard, in their basement, in their attic. And that was kind of how this whole story came together. And in the process, I met New Yorkers all over the state who this was their story. So I want to share with you this story. Some of it will be familiar if you are at all connected to Attica, and some of it perhaps will be new. The story really is centered on this place. This is Attica. And Attica, of course, is very near Batavia, New York, right off the New York State Thruway. And this is a building that was built during the Great Depression, and it is a fortress. You can't actually appreciate how much of a fortress it is. These huge 30-foot walls on the outside of Attica, but it's nestled in the middle of this beautiful farmland, right next to the tiny town of Attica. In fact, you kind of leave the downtown, the ball field, the bandstand, and you drive just a little bit outside of Attica, and this thing looms in the distance. And I've had the opportunity to spend time in Attica, and I can tell you that this institution has not changed at all. I'm talking about the geography of it, the physicality of it. In fact, you can see still the same locking mechanisms on the cells, the doors, the same kind of habits, the same culture very much at Attica. So this place still is in operation, still a maximum security facility in the state. But in 1971, this was a facility very much building towards crisis. I show you here pictures of basically two parts of this story. The guards, who are the guards? These are largely white kids from upstate New York, some of whom had come back from Vietnam. Just kids needed a job, and prisons were the job in town. Very little training for guards back then, very little preparation for what the experience of corrections would be like. Meanwhile, you have the prison, which is bursting at the seams, again, overwhelmingly with people who are coming back from Vietnam, suffering a lot of the same problems that a lot of people do today: addiction, poverty, many of the things that lead people to do things that even then were considered illegal. The thing is that in both of these groups, this group that is coming from largely the boroughs of New York City, and this group, which is growing up in the counties of upstate New York, have very little in common, don't know each other very much. But the one thing they can agree upon about this institution is that it is in trouble. Trouble is brewing in this institution. Now, what do I mean by that? This is an institution where people are being fed on 63 cents a day. This is an institution where people are given a roll of toilet paper a month, which works out to almost a square a day, if you can just imagine that. These are people who are not allowed to shower frequently enough. These are people that if you are not married to the mother of your children, you cannot see the mother of your children. You can't see your children. This is a group of people, some of whom are Spanish-speaking, Puerto Rican inmates. There's not a single guard in here who speaks Spanish. If you are a Spanish-speaking inmate and your child writes you a letter, it automatically goes in the trash because other people can't read it. There is a sense very much here that this place is going to blow. And of course, the prisoners are very aware of this. They are writing letters to the Commissioner of Corrections. They're writing letters to the State Senator. They're actually working through the system, as we often encourage people to do, to express the need for change. Meanwhile, the guards are doing the same. They're all union members. They're all members at the time of the AFSCME union. And they are basically saying, we need some change in this place. This place is dangerous. It's very much tense. We need some change. And they're not being listened to. They're not largely being listened to by the administration of the prison. And of course, neither are the prisoners. So this all builds and builds until September 9th, 1971. This is an extraordinary picture. We might in Q&A talk a little bit about some of the images that I use and why I have them. But this is an actual picture of some of the detritus, the wreckage after this eruption. The eruption is not planned. It wasn't some diabolical plot. It was actually created, in fact, by a prison administration. There had been a fight the night before. Basically, the next day, there's this attempt to lock people down, but they don't tell the guards what's going on. They don't tell the prisoners what's going on. People get locked in this long corridor. And then all of a sudden, people realize they're locked in, fear kicks in, and all hell starts to break loose. And then, because the prison maintenance had been ignored, a faulty gate comes down that is basically isolating this corridor from the nerve center of the prison called Times Square. And so all of a sudden, you've got people rushing to safety, grabbing hostages who are civilian employees or guards to ensure that, they're going to have some bargaining chip later on. People are getting hurt. People are terrified. It is chaos. It's a riot. I think we can safely say it is a riot at this moment. Not only is it a riot, but people are getting hurt. I mentioned that. One of the key people who are hurt, for example, is a guard who is standing in the middle of Times Square. He's got the keys. He is overrun. He's beaten very badly. But things are complicated in this story. Because when he is hurt so badly, actually it turns out that cooler heads are going to start to prevail. Groups of prisoners, many of whom had been isolated from each other, didn't particularly get along with each other, decide, look, this is an opportunity for us to finally bring the outside world in, see what's going on in this place. Because then, like today, unless you have a loved one on the inside, these prisons are isolated from the people who pay for them, vote for them, think that they're working. And they knew that. And so the idea was to show people what is really going on. So they did a couple of things. One thing they did for the guard that was in the middle of Times Square was they got him on a mattress. They brought him outside. They brought a lot of injured guards outside to get treatment. Then they moved everybody to one of the 4 exercise yards called D Yard. It was the farthest one away from the main gate. And they immediately start something that was really critically different than had happened in any other event, except for a little bit forecasted in some jail protests that had happened the year before in New York City. And that was, they start an uprising that is, contrary to this picture, multiracial, very diverse of ideas, political ideas, social and cultural background. And this is a group of people committed to keeping these hostages secured and safe. Now, what do I mean by that? For example, taking 2 rings of largely the Muslim prisoners surrounding these guys so that they would be protected. They understood that without any hostages, they would have 0 bargaining power, or this is what they thought. They also erected a tent city, basically. They had a medical station. They had a food distribution network. And most interestingly, they elected people to speak for them out of each of the cell blocks and created an entire apparatus for negotiations. They had a bullhorn up at the front where everything that was said at the negotiating table was also translated in Spanish, for example, so that everybody could understand what was going on. Important decisions were voted on by, basically massive yays or nays. And this is a really extraordinary event that nobody had seen before. They also do something else extraordinary. They say, we are going to invite the media in here because we want the media to see what's going on, and we want an observers committee. We want a committee of outsiders. We don't want them to necessarily negotiate for us. We want to negotiate, but we want them to oversee this negotiation to make sure that the state negotiates in good faith, to report back to the people on the outside that this is all proceeding, it's all above board, the hostages are being taken care of, etc. So the prisoners asked for some key figures, figures who they knew were sympathetic to prisoners' condition. For example, Tom Wicker of the New York Times, who had written lots of op-eds in favor of prison reform. Clarence Jones, the editor of the Amsterdam News, because he had been willing to publish the letters of prisoners from the inside. William Kunstler, who was the radical lawyer who had defended the Chicago 7 and numbers of other more outsider elements in society and offered them his criminal defense expertise. The thing was, though, that the state also put people on it. So you had Republican State Senator John Dunn, for example. You had a congressman, Herman Badillo. You had all kinds of figures on this board from various and multiple different perspectives. You had Arthur Eve, Assemblyman Arthur Eve. Again, if you're from New York, these names will be familiar to you. So this group, which eventually numbers around 40 people, are on the scene because they want to make sure that these hostage families who are very afraid on the outside have some idea of what's going on the inside. So these are some of the observers. Tom Wicker on the right, Bill Kunstler in the middle, Clarence Jones on the end. And they land in this prison. I mean, some of them had never been inside the prison. Tom Wicker comes from Hamlet, North Carolina. He just, he was a little afraid to go in. He said he was. But they even had a security team, 2 rows of prisoners, so that anyone that came into the yard would also be protected. And what did people do when they came in the yard? It was about negotiations. And I want to call your attention to this picture on the top left. On the top left picture, the bottom left is actually the Commissioner of Corrections. His name was Russell Oswald. And he's there in the yard negotiating with these guys. I also want to call your attention to 2 men standing up here on the right because I will mention them again. One of them, the tall, skinny kid with the granny glasses, his name was L.D. Barkley. He was from Rochester. And on the left with the darker glasses is a guy by the name of Frank Smith, but he went by the name Big Black, and he was from downstate in New York. And I want to note that here, everyone is hanging on everyone's word in these negotiations. Bill Kunstler down here on the right in the middle of the negotiations. And these negotiations are going on around the clock. This is 4 long days, 4 long nights of intense discussions. Eventually, they craft a list of demands. What do they want? They want things like religious freedom behind bars. They want better medical care. They want some Spanish-speaking guards. The demand is not, I want to get out of here. The demand is make this place more humane. So while this is going on, this is also going on. You have to remember that this is very much of a law enforcement town, and this is a prison. And very quickly word spreads to all of the New York counties, including Dutchess County, that there's a prison riot. And state troopers from every single county in the state of New York start descending upon upstate New York. And this is a very interesting story too, because it is not the case that state troopers are actually trained for or called out for this particular task. Not historically, not usually, and in fact, it was the National Guard that had a plan for dealing with prison riots. So this is also interesting, and it's going to go kind of hearken to what is going to come later. So these guys all show up. So negotiations going on. These guys are all showing up from upstate New York, showing up. Also, Genesee County sheriffs, deputies, parks police. I mean, the law enforcement presence that comes to this prison outside on the lawns is quite extraordinary. And here's something else that's extraordinary. Not only have these people not been asked before to do this task, right? Many had not been trained, for example, on a .270 rifle. There had been no reason to. But also, they're actually being lied to, frankly, by the FBI. The FBI is on the scene planting false stories, saying, for example, that the guys inside are holding the hostages at attention with guns at their head, and that if they fall down or sit down, they will be harmed or killed. Rumors going around that people were already killed inside. Rumors going around that basically this was a series of, just a horror show on the inside every day. So they're being stoked up, right? They are being encouraged to be angry. They're encouraged to be ready to rush in there. And they're angry at the Commissioner of Corrections because they want to say, why are you negotiating with these guys? We got to get in there. We got to save the hostages. This guy is Nelson Rockefeller. He is the man. He's the guy who is sitting either in his house in Pocono Hills, or he's sitting in New York City in his office, and he is going to be able to be the one to make decisions about Are these true? Well, I'm going the wrong direction here. Are these? Wait a second. Oh, what is happening? Why can't I back up here? This is not letting me back up. Okay, hang on. Sorry. This is literally not going the right direction. Okay, sorry. Just won't go back. It's going so fast. Okay, all right, we're gonna try this again. Okay, so, no, it's going, I'm sorry. What is, one button does not move and the other one does. So I think I got it now. Okay. So he gets to decide whether these guys get to go in or whether negotiations are going to continue. And for 4 days and 4 long nights, this is a very, very contentious discussion. And at some point, basically, it's not clear who's in charge, to be really blunt about it. These guys, the troopers, are coming armed with their personal weapons from home. By the way, also corrections officers from prisons across the state are showing up with the same. Meanwhile, weapons are being passed out of the back of trucks. No one's writing down serial numbers. There's the chain of command is completely kind of evaporated in terms of who has what. And yet everybody is kind of looking at Nelson Rockefeller. What are we going to do about this thing? And so the decision is made from the part of the observers. Let's see if we can get Nelson Rockefeller at least to come to Attica. Now, why is this important? Because a few things have happened in the interim. First of all, good news. Of the 23 demands, the state, meaning mainly the Commissioner of Corrections, Russell Oswald, has agreed to most of these demands. They are making progress. We actually know later that some of these things were probably not going to happen, but nevertheless, it looked like negotiations were pretty much proceeding. Things were going pretty well. But on the third night of this uprising, Billy Quinn, the guy who had been overrun in the middle of Times Square and beaten up for his keys, he dies. And when he dies, it is a game changer. He dies of injuries to his head. And there's, to this day, a lot of contention about exactly what happened because he had sat outside of the prison for a very long time before he got care, on the one hand. On the other hand, he was beaten up very severely by people who wanted his keys. But nevertheless, he died. And when this happens, this is a traumatic event for all kinds of reasons, but it was very significant because what it meant was that suddenly everybody in that prison could be on the hook for felony murder, which means basically you might not have done the murder, but you were adjacent to it, you were part of it, and therefore you could be responsible for it. And this is terrifying to the people who are trying to negotiate this from the inside. And so they have a very important demand now, which is for amnesty. Now, by the way, not amnesty from all criminal prosecutions, but amnesty from basically wholesale prosecutions. And most importantly, amnesty from any physical reprisals. They are terrified of what is going to happen if they surrender. So because of this, the observers, namely Tom Wicker and John Dunn, the Republican state senator, and Herman Badillo, the congressman, call Rockefeller up. And they say, we really need you to come to Attica. You don't have to go in. You don't have to actually go in the yard. You don't have to go face to face with anybody. But we need you to stand outside of this prison. And if you are not going to give these prisoners amnesty, then can you please give them your word that you will stand by the negotiated settlement and they will not be harmed if they surrender? And he basically says, thanks, but no thanks. I'm not coming. And this was a very significant moment because, of course, there had been other prison riots where, for example, Roosevelt had come to the prison, and just earlier the year before in New York, John Lindsay had come to the jails when there was an uprising there and had actually met with the prisoners. So this was something very significant when he didn't come. And so when he doesn't come, the observers are really worried. Remember that the observers are a mixed group. They don't have a dog in this fight, but they can see what the prisoners cannot see, which is that outside of the prison, members of law enforcement, namely state troopers and off-duty guards, are being absolutely infused with fury for all kinds of other reasons that my own research revealed, namely these kind of planted stories from the FBI. And again, this is the scene out there. People are passing out weapons like candy. So this is what the observers see. So backing up, they issue this statement. And they basically say to the American public, to the state of New York, they say, you got to get the governor to come. And this is the statement they issue. And they don't mince any words. They make it clear, if the governor does not come, if we cannot solve this thing peacefully, this is going to be a massacre. Meanwhile, the media is also inside. They are interviewing the guards. And one of the most kind of hardened guards, who was known as a really tough guard, he's interviewed and he says, look, basically these guys, their demands are reasonable. You got to settle this thing. And if you have any knowledge of 60s history or you remember it, he says, if you don't settle this is going to be another My Lai incident in here. So the guards themselves understood what the stakes, the hostages understood what the stakes here were. But he declined. He decided no. And in fact, I later learned behind the scenes, there's all this wrangling going on about should you come, and he was just resistant to this idea. And one of the reasons he's so resistant is because meanwhile, of course, the country has turned much more conservative, or it was going in that direction. Richard Nixon was in the White House. Rockefeller very much had his hopes on the presidency, but Rockefeller was known as a liberal Republican, especially for a lot of his policies. And Attica was kind of like the Achilles heel. You're going to show that you're tough on crime at Attica no matter what. And the consequences of this would play out in kind of horrifying slow motion. On the 5th day of the uprising, it is September in upstate New York prior to climate change. It is cold, drizzly, nasty. People have been in there for days. Tents are collapsing in the rain. People are tired. They are hungry. They want this thing to end. But they are terrified of surrendering. Amnesty has not been resolved. It feels a bit like it's an impasse. But on the other hand, the negotiated settlement is almost there. Almost everything has been agreed to. So there's also a degree of optimism. So the prisoners wake up on the morning of September 13th. It's a grisly, terrible day outside. But they are of the opinion that negotiations are and should still continue. Mind you, every morning prior to that, state officials would come down to the gate, to A gate, and they'd said, you guys, it's time, let the hostages go, it's time for you to surrender. And every time they said basically, thanks, but no thanks. We're going to continue to negotiate this thing. So this had been a kind of dialogue ongoing. On the 5th morning, what they did not know was that the decision had been made at the highest levels that they were going to take this prison by force. And again, that's why I was talking earlier about who would be the body to do that. Well, it wasn't the National Guard. It was going to be state troopers, and it wasn't going to be a very particularly clear which state troopers at first, but ultimately it was decided it was going to be Troop A was going to kind of lead this from Batavia, New York. So again, a relatively small operation. On this morning, the state comes to the gate and says to the guys, like they had said every morning, time to let the hostages go. We're done with this thing. Take it back to your people. And they do. They come back to the ground and say, are we ready this morning? Is it time to surrender? And an overwhelming cheer goes up. No, we want to negotiate this thing. The answer is no. They think negotiations are still in place. It wasn't actually until well into my research that I understood why that was. I found all kinds of documents. We can talk about that. That's a story unto itself. But basically, I found the confidential memo that came from the highest level of Rockefeller's office that basically said, do not give them an ultimatum. In other words, do not, in big letters, capital letters, in other words, don't make it clear that this assault is about ready to take place. And this would have enormous, again, implications. So on this 5th morning, the prisoners think negotiations are largely going on. They've just had this big vote. No, we're not going to surrender. We still need to work out these kinks in this agreement. And then all of a sudden, a helicopter comes up over the prison wall, kind of does a pass, kind of a reconnaissance pass. And everyone's like, wow. And here's something that's sort of almost heartbreaking when you think about it. A cheer goes up because many of them think that it's Rockefeller and that he's coming. That he's actually going to now come. We're going to turn this thing around. We're going to be able to resolve this. Meanwhile, just quickly I want to say, the world is watching this. The news is there. Walter Cronkite, you got to be old as me. Walter Cronkite is there. They're all there. And they are reporting on the scene. And what's really interesting is that the American public is quite sympathetic to this, actually. There had been a moratorium on the death penalty. We had actually started decarcerating. We had started moving towards community corrections. We had started moving towards deinstitutionalization in mental health care with the idea not that we would just let everybody, suffer, but that we would start building community-based mental health clinics and so forth. It's kind of where we were. So this idea that prisoners were part of the civil rights movement, that they had basic human rights, that the jury had sentenced them to time, but certainly not to abuse, certainly not to starvation, certainly not to what they were enduring. That's not what the sentence was. There was a feeling that this was probably an okay thing for them to mobilize around. So that's the context. So this idea that Rockefeller would come and kind of help this along, he was a liberal Republican after all, maybe this is all going to be okay. But then the helicopter leaves. And then people start to realize something terrible is about to happen. And this is a kind of a slow dawning on people of, wait a minute, the observers haven't come down today. And all of the snipers that have been on the roof, the state troopers, they're gone. And kind of this quiet settles over the prison and people get terrified. And they decide to implement something that they had talked about as kind of the last-ditched effort. If this was going to go south, what would they do? And the guards knew it. The hostages knew that this was part of the plan, and they knew this was part of the plan, even though many disagreed with its wisdom. And the plan was this. If they're going to insist upon coming in, and by the way, what did they imagine coming in meant? Coming in with clubs, coming in with fists. This is what they thought they were up against. We will take the hostages up on the 4 catwalks that overlooked the prison yards, and we would, some of them, not all the hostages, some of the hostages, and we would surround each of them with a group of prisoners, these so-called executioners, and I say so-called because this was part of the plan. So you'd have like this handmade spear or handmade knife. And the idea was that by surrounding these groups of hostages, if that helicopter was going to come back over, or if people were going to come back in, you were making it clear, wait a minute, what are you doing? We have your people. A reminder, we have your people, and you are putting them in harm from us, if not you. So up on the catwalk, imagine this situation. You've got, for example, one of the guards, Mike Smith. And Mike Smith had been the foreman of the metal shop, because this is also a workplace in this prison. And when this whole uprising jumps off, he works with another prisoner named Don Noble. And it's actually because of Don Noble that Mike Smith makes it kind of just say safety without being beaten up to the hostage circle out in the yard. And he's one of the ones that they choose to take up there. So on his right is Mike Noble with his, handmade weapon and some other prisoners. And he's blindfolded. And they're up there talking. And they are terrified. Both of them are terrified because at this point, the hostages don't much feel like their lives are going to be necessarily worth what the prisoners thought or hoped that they would be. And the conversation goes something like this. Basically, Mike says to Don, hey, if I don't get out of here, I want you to know that in my back pocket, I have a handwritten note to my wife, Sharon. And I need you to find her, and you need to tell her that I love her. And Don basically says the same. Where his people are, they kind of exchange this. And they're terrified. As Mike described it, his knees were shaking, his stomach was upset. Next to him, Ron Kozlowski, another hostage. His executioner kind of combs his hair and says, here's a cigarette, if this is a cigarette for your nerves, this is going to be okay. And no sooner do they get up there when all of a sudden another helicopter starts to hover up over the prison. And the way Mike Smith, the guard, describes it is he says, this is a much bigger bird. And he says, it was so close and so large, he said, you could feel the concussion in your chest. And at this point, they are, like I said, terrified. This helicopter comes over and starts dropping canisters of CN and CS gas over the yard. And for those of you who are not radical veterans of the 60s protest movements, what does that mean? Gas is a bit of a misnomer. It's actually a powder. And every time these canisters would explode, this powder was sticking on people's hands, their arms, in their mucous membranes, in their eyes, down their throat, up their nose. And it literally fells people. The gas is dropped, and you can just watch people falling like dominoes across the yard and across the catwalk. People are vomiting, they're retching, they're blinded. And it is at this moment that the ground assault on Attica starts. This is what it looked like from the perspective of state troopers who were actually filming this when this went on. You can see how thick the gas is. The troopers who went in had gas masks, and even they were choking. They were harmed by the gas. But they're heavily armed. And for the next 15 minutes, all you can hear is the sound of gunfire. To another sound, which is the first helicopter circling back over, intoning through a loudspeaker over and over and over again, surrender with your hands up and you won't be harmed. Surrender with your hands up and you won't be harmed. So within 15 minutes, it is nonstop, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. That's all you can hear. These are many people who are already on the ground. And it is carnage within 15 minutes. You have 128 people shot, some of them 6, 7 times. You have guards and prisoners alike who have been, I'm going to get off of this image for a moment, who have been badly injured, kicked off of the 50-foot catwalk down to the ground, stomped on, hit with rifle butts, and so forth. You have guards that are now laying dead in the hostage circle. Most of them have been killed by buckshot, because if you can imagine in the confined space of this prison yard, people are shooting pellets. So the spray is like a massive spray. And this is bad news, because it's bad news for all the obvious reasons, but it's actually bad news for the state of New York, who's actually ordered this. Maybe not so much because prisoners have died, because they're pretty confident no one's going to care about that, but the hostages have been killed. 10 hostages, 29 prisoners, now dead, and 128 total shot. But that's not the story the American people heard. No sooner does this go down, and by the way, there's still the sounds of guns going off, even though the full order has been taken in this prison. Commissioner of Corrections stands out in front of the prison, so does the PR guy, Gerald Houlihan, and tells the American people that something completely different happened than what happened. And when I say tells the American people, what do I mean? Every media outlet is there. The UPI, the AP, the New York Times, the LA Times, the London Times, you name it, they're there. And what they say is that this has been a great success, that they've saved the hostages. Unfortunately, some of the hostages died, but the hostages died because the prisoners killed them. They slit their throats. One of the guards, by the way, it was Mike Smith, one of the guards has been castrated. And these prisoners were so barbaric, they shoved his testicles into his mouth after doing that. Even as bad, they had killed guards already, and they buried them in the yard. And the reporters are horrified, and they're taking notes, and they're saying, what? And they double down, they say, I saw this with my own eyes. We have footage of it. So this story goes out on the front page of the New York Times. And there's so much to say here, but just calling your attention to the bottom quote, this reflects a barbarism wholly alien to civilized society. Prisoners slash the throats of utterly helpless, unarmed guards. Increasingly revolutionary, militant set of demands. The front page of the LA Times. The prisoners killed the hostages. And every small town newspaper across America because of the UPI and the AP Newswire. The thing is, it didn't happen. But this is extremely important because this is a generation of viewers. By the way, this is before the 24-hour news cycle. This is before Twitter. This is before the internet. So people read newspapers. People tuned into the NBC Nightly News and the CBS Nightly News. And people feel ripped off, bamboozled. We're all for civil rights, but this ain't civil rights. This is thuggery. These people are animals. And they start sending telegrams in to the prison itself, to every newspaper, calling for the death penalty, wanting to know why more prisoners hadn't been killed, demanding that there should be even harsher conditions, not better conditions. But this is what's going on actually behind the scenes. Not only were people killed, all of them by gunfire, guard and trooper gunfire, but that was just the beginning of what will become days, weeks of torture. Nobody can see it because it's behind prison walls. Lawyers are banging on the door to get in. Doctors are banging on the door to get in. The National Guard is brought in to do medical triage, and basically they can't do it. They're trying to get people to the hospital. There's enormous resistance to moving people to the hospital. The level of trauma in this yard, one National Guardsman said it looked like a Civil War painting. Other people said this was worse than my experience in Vietnam. The American people don't know anything about this. The guy on the right is the guy with the dark glasses, big black. He's the guy that they say is the one who castrated Mike Smith. That's the one they were talking about when they stood out in front of the media. Again, never happened. Mike Smith, it turns out, had been shot 4 times across the abdomen in precision by a fellow guard who didn't like the fact, basically, none of them, a lot of the fellow guards didn't like Mike because he had a good relationship with the prisoners. They had brought some of their initial concerns to him. They had written to the commissioner and said, what do you think about this letter? And he says, I think it's a good letter. I think you should send it. And he was hated for it. He was targeted for it. But this is the guy who they say did it. They keep him on this table for hours and hours. And because he's the captain of the football team in prison, they put this football under his neck and they say, if you let this drop, we will kill you. And he has every reason to think this is going to happen because he's just watched all these people gunned down. By the way, none of them had guns. And they're dropping hot shells on him. They are beating him. He is in extremis. The below picture is after he leaves this yard. He and all the other prisoners are forced to run a gauntlet through broken glass and the beating batons of law enforcement. Why broken glass? Because every window's been shot out of Attica. So people have been stripped, forced to run the gauntlet, then beaten, and then he's taken up to HBZ block, which is the segregation block where it all begins again for him. The hostage families also don't know what's going on. The hostage families are also traumatized. they're being, first of all, they don't know, no one's telling them anything. But their husbands have been killed, their sons have been killed, their brothers have been killed. And they're told that this is because of the prisoners, so they're furious at the prisoners. But meanwhile, they also can't get any straight answers. Cunningham, the one who said this is going to be another Miley incident, he was the father of many kids. His wife was a stay-at-home mom. Many of the Attica widows were. And she's told, just like they're all told, that the prisoners have slit the throats of their husband. She goes to the small town funeral home, because they all know each other. It was Marley's funeral home. They all knew Mr. Marley. And she goes into the funeral home, and he is terrified because there's all these guys standing around, very intimidatingly. And he and other funeral directors are made to sign affidavits saying that these guys had had their throats slit when they hadn't. And he brings Mrs. Cunningham to the back where her husband is, and he lifts up the sheet so she can see what's happened to him, and he goes like this. He's terrified to tell her. Also, there's the local coroner, and he's getting the bodies. He's not a political guy. He's not a lefty. In fact, he's pretty conservative. And he's getting the bodies. He's like, wait a minute. Every one of these people have been shot. And the only two people who've had some knife, from the makeshift knife damage, is on the back of their neck from somebody having fallen down after they've been shot like this. And there's like two of them. And he's also being intimidated. His bay is being filled with members of law enforcement because they also understand that this thing has gone terribly, terribly wrong. And on behalf of what they're going through, not trained for this, basically going to be the sacrificial lamb for the top level administration who sent them in. And they know that this is going to be very, very bad news. And so the coroner decides that he's going to go public, and he says, incredibly brave man, he says to the public, after all these stories have gone out, not a single guard has been killed with a slit throat. They've all been shot. Everybody has been shot. And the Rockefeller's administration's response to this is to discredit him, to say he's a communist, and they bring in two more coroners to basically say, to see if maybe there's a different way to spin this. Meanwhile, Rockefeller is on the phone with Nixon. I found the tapes that they had of their conversations, and basically Nixon congratulates him on a really good job, and he says, I have a question for you. Was this a black business? And Rockefeller says, why, yes, Mr. President, it was. He says, okay, basically. Well, this'll have, what he said, a salutary effect on the Angela Davises of the world and anyone who thinks that they're going to start something. So the hostage families don't know what's going on. They've lost loved ones. The coroner is trying to tell the truth, but meanwhile, these kinds of telegrams are pouring in to upstate New York. But you got a whole lot of dead bodies. There's going to have to be some investigations here, right? So there are. There's a Citizens Commission that investigates it. There's congressional hearings. There's a Justice Department investigation, which stunningly they decide there's nothing to investigate, even though they're getting all this testimony from everything from National Guardsmen to troopers who were so traumatized by what happened, to guards, to prisoners, saying, you got to investigate this. This is a civil rights investigation. Why civil rights? Because in big letters across one of the Attica's walls, white power, the guards are coming out, the troopers are coming out saying, white power as they're walking out. We have it on film. No, they don't want to investigate. So the main investigation comes down to Rockefeller's own investigation, which is pretty extraordinary. Now, a lot of the people in this story do a lot of good things in a lot of other good contexts, but I'm just talking about this context. And the investigation is meant to do two things. It's meant to investigate trooper wrongdoing or law enforcement wrongdoing, guard wrongdoing, and prisoner wrongdoing, both. And there's going to be all kinds of personnel assigned to this. It's going to be a hugely expensive investigation. But the first thing that happens is who's put in charge of the investigation? The BCI. Troopers. several of whom are the same troopers who were involved in the retaking. So needless to say, there's no chalk markings taken of any body. None of the evidence is collected. In fact, the evidence that is collected that might have been damaged is all scooped up, buried behind the prison. The only evidence that is collected is things like baseball bats and anything that can be construed as a prisoner weapon, and some of the actual prisoner weapons that were used up on the catwalk, the makeshift weapons. Photographs are being doctored. Like there's the photograph of the prisoner who's got a big knife in his hand in one photograph, but the exact same position before when he was also dead, he has no knife in his hand. Tapes are being spliced. You can see all of this footage that's being filmed by the state troopers. You can hear the gunshots, but you can't see anyone shooting any guns. Photographs are being doctored. Stuff is being literally burned in the fireplace of one of the head troopers who's in charge of the investigation. Statements are being doctored. Everyone's saying that they were charged up, they were under threat for their lives by the prisoners, but the stories don't hold up. So there's a first generation of statements, there's a second generation of statements, there's a third generation of statements. This is the investigation that they inherit, and that too is going to quickly change history, and I'm going to go a little bit more quickly here. What happens, here we go again, I don't go in the wrong direction. What happens is that 62 prisoners are indicted on 42 separate felony indictments for what happened at Attica, and not a single member of law enforcement is indicted. What we now know is that from the moment that Attica happened, there was in the process, and believe you me, historians do not use this word lightly, a cover-up underway. My book is in 3 parts. The first part is about the Uprising, blow-by-blow narrative. The second part is about these criminal trials that will come out of this, which are an incredible story. And then the third part is about when there is going to be a civil case, which I'll tell you in a minute. But throughout, this is really a story of cover-up. This is about the burning of documents. This is about the changing of statements. This is about the changing of stories. This is about a denial of what happened. For years, state officials said, no, there was no torture at Attica. It was nothing but a fraternity hazing. It just didn't happen. And to underscore the fact to the American public that Attica is all about the bad guys, the prisoners, not only is those stories going out on the front page of the New York Times, LA Times, every other thing, but now for the next 5 years, everybody paraded before the media is going to be an Attica prisoner. Meanwhile, the head of the state police is being given a deal for immunity. No troopers are being indicted. The guards are not being indicted. They're kind of slipping away. But the guards who've been harmed, they're also getting the shaft. Basically, what happens to them is that while this is going on, state officials are going to their house, and I was able to find these documents, it's just an incredible story, going to their house with a check. Mrs. Cunningham, here's a little check to tide you over. Groceries, Mrs. Cunningham needs the check. Some of these checks, $42, $142, depending on how big your family was. Going to the hospital, trying to give these checks to people who were recovering, trying to survive. Just a little something. But of course, the minute they cashed these checks, they were not told that they had elected a remedy under New York state law that they could not sue their employer. One surviving guard widow did not cash her check. And she ends up later being able to sue the state of New York. She gets more than $1 million, and they fought her tooth and nail, including turning every office upside down to find that canceled check, which they could not find because she did not cash it. She happened to have a friend who worked for a lawyer and who said, don't cash it. So they're being screwed over. The prisoners are being screwed over. People on the most kind of egregious acts done by troopers, these guys are being sort of slowly made to retire. But of course, a lot of them are traumatized. They're going to show up later in the criminal trial. One of the reasons why we know the horror that goes on is because some of the state troopers come forward later and they tell the story. They say, You know, my colleagues were taking off their identifying badges when they went in there so nobody would know who they were. They were bringing in ammunition outlawed by the Geneva Convention, bringing in deer slug bullets that would expand upon impact. This is not the end of the story, because this is Big Black. At the end of the criminal trials, because of one of the most dramatic defense efforts in American history, eventually only 5 groups of trials will go forward, and only one of them ends in convictions. Law students, lawyers descend from all over the country on upstate New York to defend the Attica prisoners, to make sure that they all had representation. And they do a pretty extraordinary job. But then there's a whistleblower inside of the Attica investigation, this incredibly brave man by the name of Malcolm Bell, who notices that they're only prosecuting prisoners, notices that they have not prosecuted any troopers, and basically says, what's going on here? We have tons of evidence against members of law enforcement. Why are we giving deals? Why are we not prosecuting anybody? Why are we not indicting anybody? He ends up writing a whistleblowing document. There was only 3 copies, and it outlined all the evidence that they had against the offending members of law enforcement. A document that I ended up finding, because people had been protected for 45 years. And that story is in part because when Malcolm Bell blows the whistle, the governor at the time decides, we're just gonna draw a line under Attica. Yep, mistakes were made. Prosecution was not exactly even-handed, but you know what? It's time to move forward. We're going to, quote unquote, close the book on Attica, which meant vacating the rest of the prisoners' indictments, offering clemency for people who had been actually convicted, 2 of them. And from here on out, there will be no indictments of law enforcement either. So for the people who had endured torture and murder and death, that wasn't good enough. And so people like Big Black never give up. They file a massive class action suit that takes decades to finally be resolved. That's the 3rd part of the book. And it's an extraordinary story of obfuscation and delays and denials. But they win ultimately, and he is the top end of the damages award. This is a mostly white jury in upstate New York, but when they hear what actually happened, they give him a pretty amazing civil award. And he's the top end of the damages, $950,000, and the bottom end of the damages, which was still horrific, I think it was $25,000. There's 1,200 people in this class. So you do the math. So what happens next? It goes to appeal, and they're told, you're not a class. Go back to the drawing board. Meanwhile, these guys are getting sick. They're traumatized. They have PTSD. Their lives have completely fallen apart. They're not in prison anymore, but this has been devastating. So he makes sure that this civil suit is going to go forward. It was filed at the same time as the retaking, but first all the criminal trials had to be resolved before this one could even be taken on. And this case eventually is going to result in a settlement, a historic settlement for the prisoners. By the way, settled by a Rockefeller appointee Republican judge by the name of Michael Teleska, who lets these guys come into his courtroom, come up to the dais, and basically just tell their stories so that it's all on the record. Doesn't cross-examine them, doesn't question them, just says, tell your story. And you can read this. A lot of the stories are in the book, but you can actually go to see the original documents, and it's chilling. The one that Judge Teleska always told was of the guy who's like almost 7 feet tall, very tall guy. He ended up in prison, I think it was on a drug addiction problem, and basically he was a basketball player, and he was very young, and there was a possibility of him actually playing professional ball when he got out. And during the retaking, members of law enforcement basically take their rifle butts and they break every bone in his feet. And so basically he has to kind of hobble up to Judge Teleska's bench and apologizing for how long it's taking him to tell his story. People who had false teeth, who had eyeglasses, they were stripped of everything, and members of law enforcement were throwing up the glasses and smashing them with baseball bats. Grinding dentures into the ground. Many, many much more graphic and horrific things, but I don't need to share those with you because I can actually tell you a story like this and you understand what it means to deny somebody the ability to see or eat. That's the level of violence we're talking about. This story ends up getting told. There is a settlement. And when they get a settlement, the guards, who also have been isolated, living in poverty, feeling like they have been utterly ripped off, abandoned, they come together and they also can't sue the state of New York because they've all been knocked out of the ballpark on that, but they lobby in Albany and they also get a settlement. But what they would tell you, that's Dee Quinn Miller on the left, that is the daughter of Billy Quinn. She became very good friends with Big Black as they went through a lot of this together. What she would tell you, what Mike Smith would tell you, what Big Black did say before he passed away from cancer is this was not justice, but it was the closest thing to justice we were ever going to get. Why does this matter? Because again, we are at a moment in American history where we have locked up more people than any other country on the planet. We didn't do it because the crime rate was unprecedented. There have been many times in American history when the crime rate has been high. In fact, the crime rate in every country goes like this. Up, down, up, down. In fact, tends to be more down when there's more investment in the society, more investment in education, more investment in communities. But the incarceration rate, this national committee dug into the numbers, looked at it carefully. The incarceration rate is divorced largely from the crime rate. And if anything, high rates of incarceration are what we call criminogenic because they destroy community, they actually create more crime. So we have this problem, which is why did we do this? The prison rate in American history had been kind of like this always. Not too high probably, but pretty steady throughout American history, even though the crime rate goes up and down. Highest during Prohibition, just like highest during the drug war that we brought on. Why did we do it? Well, in order to understand why we did it, we have to understand what people thought they were doing. And people who had come of age in the 60s, hopeful moment of civil rights, are looking carefully at these moments of conflict, particularly between law enforcement and students, law enforcement and prisoners, law enforcement and community members in general. And they came away from the 60s with this idea that the problem with civil rights was students are too violent. Prisoners are violent. But yet you look at the period the way historians do, and you actually look at the violence, you count it, you say, well, who had the guns? Who was dead? What happened? You look at Kent State. You look at Orangeburg, South Carolina in 1969. You look at the Chicago National Convention in 1968. And what you actually discover is that the preponderance of this violence is actually state violence. But yet we made the decision to double down on prisons, punitive sentencing, and to lock up social problems rather than try to deal with them in a humane manner. Why did we do that? Well, in no small part, it was because of the lies told at the time about what was really going on. Attica, unfortunately, was one of those stories, and only one, but it was a deeply significant one because it was televised, because it was in New York, and New York, as we all know, is ground zero in the country. Everything happens in New York, especially if it happens in New York City. That's what my son lives in New York City. That's what he tells me. So this was a really consequential thing. But the other thing that Attica showed was that actually you can't cover things up forever. You can't imagine that stories won't eventually be told by the people whose stories they really are. And so Attica matters on a number of different levels. And I thank you for allowing me to share that story with you.
Okay, we have time for a few questions. Is there?
Thank you so much. I believe that it was society which actually caused it. Society was the one which asked all the our representatives, our government, to incarcerate people, right? If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, the security side of the business, when anything happens, they always go back to security, and people want to be secured, so they don't care, right? They were saying we have to incarcerate them. So that's how the whole thing happened. So how can a society, what can we do to change that mindset? Thank you.
Well, what's really interesting about that, you're right. And when people feel afraid, right, the impulse is lock it up, shut it down, get a gun, protect ourselves. That's a very normal human impulse. But that's why education is so important. That's why storytelling is so important. Because the people who've really looked at this carefully from every political persuasion in countries across the globe know that that doesn't make us safer. And they know what makes us safer. And how we know it, because if you ask people, where do they want to live in this country? They don't want to live in communities that are filled with police officers or have bars on windows or have police in schools or bars on the stores they shop. That's not where people want to live. They want to live in communities and do live in communities where there's not a police officer in the school and there's beautiful parks and there's camp for your kids and there's resources if your child is addicted to something. We know how to do public safety. Middle class people do it all the time. We do it every day, right? We know every family has trauma. Every community experiences crime. But do you know that the communities that have resources, the actual last people that they want to call for social problems is the police? Because they don't want their person locked up. They want their person helped, right? So we know how to make people safe. And the question is, why is always the default position of security? That's something that we need to think about. Why do we have this level of misinformation about what makes us safe when our own lives even belie that information?
To what extent do you think that there's a money-making industry involved, which includes obviously prosecution, defense, prisons, law enforcement cops? It's like it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and even if the crime rate goes down.
Yeah. Well, one thing that is very interesting about that is that prior to the rise of mass incarceration, for example, we had largely made prison labor unprofitable in this country. We had all kinds of regulations on prison labor, for example. But once people started to realize, we got 2 million people locked up, that's an opportunity. All of a sudden there's this attempt, very successful attempt to overhaul all these regulations against prison labor, to privatize in prison everything from tampons to tasers to telephones. These are business decisions and political decisions, which kind of goes back to my point. This is not about public safety. It's about accessing a market. And in this case, it is a confined market of people who cannot vote, who under our Constitution are allowed to be held in slavery because of the 13th Amendment. And when they get out, they are barred from voting in many, many states because of felon disfranchisement, so they can't weigh in on the policy. And in the state of New York, until we finally got rid of it, we had prison gerrymandering in New York. So that meant that all these people from New York City that were incarcerated at Attica or Greenhaven or any number of these places, their bodies in those counties counted for those counties' census population. So that meant that those populations of those counties had more political power than the political power of those communities where those people came from. But they couldn't vote. So it was like the 3/5 clause all over again. Your body counts for the vote of somebody else, but you can't vote. So when we ask, how did we do this? The people who it affects the most have not gotten to weigh in on it. And that is a huge problem for a democracy.
In your research, you mentioned that the FBI was like planting stories with the state troopers, and it kind of reminded me of like other documents I've read where they were like plant fake stories within the Black Panther Party. So do you think that the FBI doing that at Attica was an extension of the COINTELPRO program?
Yes, it very much was. And in fact, I kept getting hints along the road of this research. I mean, I think I could write an entire book about the research journey of this book, I swear to God, because it was, I mean, at times it was like, skulking around, the back roads of upstate New York trying to talk to people. And one of the things that I got a hint of is that there was actually a COINTELPRO-like program meant specifically for prison uprisings. And it was called Operation Shadow something. And I tried, and I just could not get hold of it. Remember, the only reason we know about COINTELPRO is because some radicals basically busted into the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and found the documents and released them. And just so you know, this story that you have been just told about Attica, this was not the public story. I worked on a documentary. We were actually just a finalist for the documentary in the Oscars on Attica. I worked with Stanley Nelson on it. And, he tells this story so beautifully. And so now a lot of people have seen that. They're like, oh, yeah, I know what happened at Attica. Nobody knew what had happened to Attica because those documents were completely buried. I mean, people who lived it knew, right? But the public didn't know. And misinformation is a really dangerous thing, for sure.
How much of an impact did Nixon's war on drugs have on incarceration?
A huge one, right? Because Attica and things like that become the tool when you're on the floor of state legislature to pass things like the drug laws. It is not coincidental that Attica happens in 1971, and initially there's this spate of prison reform bills that go through the New York State legislature. But right after that, we get the Rockefeller drug laws of 1973. And I mean, he's doubling down on the war on crime. And those laws get duplicated in every state across the nation. Michigan had something called the 650 lifer law, where you had 650 grams of cocaine, which is, not very much, automatic life sentence. This all is endorsed sort of at the top level by the White House, who is at this time Nixon.
So, thank you so much for this incredibly interesting and important story. My question is, do you think that things in prisons got better nowadays, and if it can happen again?
So this is a very painful answer to your question. No, things got much worse. And that might surprise you because we think about prisons of the olden days as, oh, those were the hellholes. That's why the Attica brothers rose up, right? Because they were so bad. With mass incarceration came severe overcrowding. It came the introduction of gangs into prisons, made them much less safe, the erosion of medical care, the privatization of medical care, the rise in the incidence of deaths in custody, the rise in the incidence of abuse, and really most alarmingly, the rise in the amount of time that prisoners in America spend in solitary confinement. So, unfortunately, because of the lies told at Attica, what could have been the message, which is we need to humanize these places. That is not to say don't take responsibility. That is not to say let's let everybody out and be a criminal and do whatever the hell they want. No. It says when someone gets the sentence from a jury, that is the sentence, time away. not everything else that comes on top of it. And we missed the memo. In fact, we missed it for good reason, because we didn't know what the memo actually said.
Okay, so I think that's it. And thank you, Dr. Thompson, for the terrific
Thank
story
you.
and your time.
Thank you so much.
And of course, the lengthier story is between those book covers that are
Very
sale.
lengthy.
Very lengthy, doorstopper. So please, the books are outside, and thank you, Heather.
Thank you.